The narrative dominating much of the media coverage suggests that Ukraine is the side most vulnerable to the coming winter, portraying the cold season as a decisive weapon in Russia's strategy. According to this framing, Ukraine's struggle to maintain power, heat, and civilian resilience under sustained Russian strikes on energy infrastructure is presented as the central danger of the conflict. The image is clear and repeated frequently: a nation bracing itself against freezing temperatures, darkness, and hardship, with winter looming as an existential test. This interpretation has become so widespread that it is often accepted without question, shaping public perception and strategic discussions alike. However, the script challenges this dominant narrative by arguing that it fundamentally misidentifies where the real threat lies. While it is undeniable that Ukraine faces serious difficulties during the winter months, the script insists that focusing solely on Ukraine's hardship obscures a far more consequential reality. The true crisis, it argues, is not primarily unfolding on the Ukrainian side of the border, but deep within Russia itself. Winter is not merely a physical challenge of cold weather and energy demand. It is a stress test that exposes the internal strength or weakness of a state's economic and political systems. In this context, the script reframes winter as a magnifying force, one that intensifies existing structural problems rather than creating new ones. What winter reveals in Russia is not resilience, but fragility. Inside Russia, winter is amplifying deep economic failures that have been building over time, particularly those driven by the demands of a prolonged war economy. Rather than serving as a strategic advantage, the cold months are placing additional pressure on a system already stretched thin. The script emphasizes that Russia is entering winter burdened by a collapsing economic framework that has been reshaped almost entirely around sustaining the war. This transformation has come at an immense cost, draining financial reserves, distorting normal economic activity, and prioritizing military expenditure over long-term stability. Winter does not create these problems, but it accelerates their consequences. The idea that Russia is attempting to freeze Ukraine into surrender is central to the prevailing narrative. Yet the script argues that this strategy is backfiring. Instead of Ukraine being pushed toward collapse, Russia itself is moving into the cold season carrying the weight of mounting deficits and shrinking revenues. These financial pressures are not abstract figures on paper. They translate directly into reduced flexibility, higher costs, and fewer options for managing economic shocks. As energy consumption rises during winter and revenues fail to keep pace, the imbalance becomes increasingly difficult to conceal or manage. The script makes clear that Russia's war economy is no longer operating on a sustainable footing. The constant demand for resources to fund military operations has outpaced the state's ability to generate income, particularly as traditional revenue streams weaken. Winter intensifies this imbalance by increasing domestic energy needs and operational costs at precisely the moment when financial inflows are declining. Rather than demonstrating strength, the cold months expose how dependent Russia has become on an economic model that cannot support prolonged strain. Crucially, the script reframes winter as something more than a seasonal challenge. It presents winter as a catalyst, an event that accelerates the exposure of underlying weaknesses that might otherwise remain hidden for longer. The harsh conditions force systems to operate at peak capacity, revealing whether they are fundamentally sound or dangerously overextended. In Russia's case, winter threatens to strip away the illusion of stability that has been carefully maintained, revealing the unsustainable foundations of its war strategy. By shifting attention away from surface-level narratives and towards structural realities, the script argues that the real winter danger lies not in Ukraine's ability to endure hardship, but in Russia's ability to sustain its economic model under pressure. The cold months bring with them higher costs, reduced margins for error, and an unforgiving environment for financial mismanagement. What emerges is a picture of a state entering winter not from a position of strength, but already weakened and increasingly vulnerable. In this framing, winter becomes a turning point rather than a weapon. It does not guarantee immediate collapse, but it accelerates trends that are already underway. The script establishes that the coming cold season will expose whether Russia's war economy can withstand prolonged strain or whether it will fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. The threat, therefore, is not simply freezing temperatures, but the revelation of an economic strategy that cannot endure them. This section centers on the clear confirmation that Russia has entered a full recession, a reality that stands in direct contradiction to the earlier official denials issued by its leadership. For months, warnings from economists and internal institutions were dismissed or downplayed, creating the impression that Russia's economy was merely slowing rather than deteriorating. The script makes it explicit that this phase of ambiguity is over. Russia is no longer standing on the edge of economic decline. It has already crossed into it. The recession is not speculative, temporary, or theoretical. It is measurable, acknowledged by data, and increasingly visible in state finances. The script reinforces this conclusion by highlighting statements from Ukraine's foreign leadership, which draw attention to the severity of Russia's economic condition. These statements are not presented in isolation but are supported by concrete economic indicators that paint a consistent and troubling picture. Federal budget deficits have reached record-breaking levels, signaling that the state is spending far more than it is able to generate. At the same time, regional governments that once enjoyed surpluses are now facing deficits of their own, compounding the problem across the entire structure of the state. This is not a localized financial issue but a systemic one, affecting every level of governance. Declining oil and gas revenues occupy a central place in this analysis, as these sectors have long formed the backbone of Russia's fiscal stability. The script emphasizes that the erosion of energy income is particularly damaging because it strikes at the core of the country's revenue model. As profits from oil and gas fall, the state loses one of its most reliable tools for balancing budgets and funding large-scale expenditures. This decline is occurring at the same time that military spending remains extraordinarily high, creating a widening gap between income and obligations that cannot be easily closed. Rising debt further illustrates the depth of the crisis. The script explains that borrowing has become an increasingly necessary tool to sustain government operations, but it is not a solution, it is a delay. Debt accumulation signals that current revenues are insufficient to cover ongoing costs, especially those generated by the war. As interest obligations grow and fiscal space narrows, debt becomes another pressure point rather than a safety valve. The longer the war continues, the more this debt compounds, locking the state into a cycle that becomes progressively harder to escape. Military spending is portrayed as a central driver of this economic collapse. The script underscores that the scale of defense expenditure is unsustainable in the context of shrinking revenues and expanding deficits. Resources that might otherwise support economic stabilization are instead consumed by the demands of the war. This imbalance is not temporary, as there is no indication that spending levels are decreasing. Instead, military commitments continue to absorb a disproportionate share of state funds, crowding out other economic priorities and deepening financial instability. A key argument of the script is that Russia is no longer approaching economic danger, it is already immersed in it. This distinction is crucial. Approaching danger implies time, options, and the possibility of corrective action. Being already in danger implies constraint, urgency, and limited room to maneuver. The script stresses that many of the traditional tools used to manage economic stress have lost their effectiveness. The scale of the deficits, the speed of revenue decline, and the magnitude of spending obligations leave little space for meaningful recovery without fundamental change. The cost of the war is presented as a defining factor in this downward spiral. Estimated at up to $1 billion per day, the financial burden of sustaining military operations is portrayed as overwhelming. This cost is not offset by economic growth, increased taxation, or energy income. Instead, it drains state resources at a pace that exceeds replenishment. The script makes clear that even aggressive taxation measures cannot compensate for the scale of the losses, particularly as economic activity slows and the tax base weakens. Energy income, once the cornerstone of fiscal resilience, is no longer sufficient to counterbalance expenses. As revenues continue to fall faster than costs can be controlled, the gap widens with each passing month. The script emphasizes that this imbalance is structural, not cyclical. It is driven by the fundamental mismatch between the financial demands of war and the economic capacity of the state under current conditions. Attempts to manage this gap through short-term measures only postpone the consequences rather than resolve them. Ultimately, this section presents Russia's recession as the logical outcome of an overstretched war economy. The collapse is not sudden or accidental but the result of sustained pressure applied to a system that lacks the capacity to absorb it. The script positions the recession as evidence that the economic foundations supporting the war are eroding rapidly. With deficits growing, revenues shrinking, debt rising, and military spending remaining unchecked, Russia is locked into a financial spiral that grows more severe with time. The danger is no longer looming. It is present, active, and accelerating. This section examines how Russia's leadership responded to mounting economic warning signs not with corrective reform, but with denial and dismissal. As indicators of economic strain became increasingly difficult to ignore, the response from the top was not one of adjustment or restraint, but of refusal to acknowledge the scale of the problem. The script emphasizes that this pattern of denial was not subtle. It was explicit and sustained. Rather than preparing the country for an impending downturn, the leadership chose to reject the very idea that recession posed a real threat, treating economic reality as something that could be overridden by political will. Despite clear and repeated signals from economic ministers, the central bank, and broader market indicators, these warnings were brushed aside. Officials responsible for monitoring economic health pointed to slowing growth, declining productivity, and mounting imbalances, yet their assessments failed to influence policy direction. The script highlights that these were not speculative concerns but data-driven conclusions coming from within Russia's own institutional framework. Nevertheless, the leadership dismissed the risks, signaling a belief that acknowledging weakness was more dangerous than ignoring it. This dismissal extended to attempts to impose control over economic outcomes through rhetoric rather than policy. The script underscores the idea that economic reality was treated as something that could be commanded into compliance, rather than managed through structural reform. By insisting that recession must not occur, the leadership substituted denial for strategy. This approach did not remove the underlying pressures. It merely delayed their visible impact while allowing them to intensify beneath the surface. As inflation surged and interest rates climbed, the consequences of this mismanagement became unavoidable. Rising prices eroded purchasing power, while higher borrowing costs restricted access to credit for both households and businesses. Instead of addressing the root causes of these conditions, the leadership shifted the burden downward. The script makes clear that the response to fiscal strain was not redistribution from the state or reduction in war-related spending, but increased extraction from the general population. Tax hikes became a central mechanism through which this burden was transferred. Ordinary Russians were required to contribute more at a time when their incomes were already under pressure. The increase in value-added tax amplified this effect, as VAT applies broadly across goods and services, ensuring that the cost was felt daily and universally. The script emphasizes that even modest percentage increases translated into significant cumulative losses for households struggling with rising living expenses. Reduced subsidies further compounded the strain. Support mechanisms that once helped offset costs were scaled back, leaving individuals and families more exposed to inflation and economic volatility. At the same time, taxation was expanded to encompass a wider range of small and medium-sized businesses. These enterprises, which often operate with narrow margins, faced increased reporting requirements and higher tax obligations, limiting their ability to absorb shocks or invest in growth. The script frames this as a direct squeeze on the productive backbone of the domestic economy. The cumulative effect of these measures was a steady deterioration in public financial security. As incomes failed to keep pace with prices and borrowing became more expensive, financial vulnerability spread. Savings eroded, consumption declined, and uncertainty became a defining feature of everyday life. The script stresses that this process was not accidental but the predictable outcome of policies designed to sustain the war economy at the expense of domestic stability. At the same time, the script draws a sharp contrast between the experiences of ordinary citizens and those tied to the war economy. While the general population grows poorer, individuals and entities connected to defense production, state contracts, and wartime logistics continue to profit. This disparity deepens internal inequality, creating a widening gap between those who bear the costs of the war and those who benefit from it. The script emphasizes that this imbalance is corrosive, not only economically but socially, as it undermines cohesion and trust. This unequal distribution of pain accelerates economic decay by distorting incentives and concentrating resources in sectors that do not contribute to long-term stability. Instead of supporting broad-based growth or resilience, capital flows toward activities driven by conflict rather than productivity. The script presents this as a self-reinforcing cycle. Denial leads to mismanagement, mismanagement leads to public squeeze, and the resulting inequality further weakens the economic foundation. Ultimately, this outline portrays economic decline as the consequence of choices made at the leadership level. By rejecting reform and imposing costs on the population, the system sacrifices sustainability for short-term continuity. The script stresses that the growing poverty and vulnerability of ordinary Russians are not incidental effects, but central features of an economic model designed to prioritize war above all else. As inequality deepens and decay accelerates, the gap between political narratives and lived reality becomes impossible to ignore, exposing the long-term damage inflicted by denial-driven governance under Vladimir Putin. The final outline concentrates on the role of Western sanctions and their escalating impact on Russia's energy-driven revenue system, presenting them as a central force shaping the country's economic trajectory. The script frames sanctions not as symbolic gestures, but as structural constraints that directly target the financial foundations of Russia's war economy. Over time, These measures have narrowed the state's access to revenue, technology, insurance, and markets, gradually reducing its ability to rely on energy exports as a stabilizing force. The emphasis here is not on sudden collapse, but on cumulative pressure that grows heavier with each passing month. At the core of this pressure lies the decline of oil and gas income, which has long served as the backbone of Russia's federal budget. The script details how this income stream has been severely weakened by a combination of price declines, export disruptions, and targeted strikes on energy infrastructure. Falling prices reduce the value of each barrel sold, while logistical and market constraints limit the volume that can be exported profitably. Together, these forces undermine the reliability of energy revenue as a source of fiscal stability, exposing how dependent the state has become on a sector now operating under sustained strain. Export disruptions play a particularly important role in this decline. Sanctions complicate shipping, financing, and insurance, making it harder for Russian energy products to reach buyers. Even when oil and gas can be exported, the terms are often less favorable, with discounts and delays eroding profitability. The script underscores that these disruptions are not isolated incidents but part of a broader pattern that steadily constrains cash flow. As a result, revenue projections become increasingly difficult to meet, forcing the state to operate with shrinking margins. Targeted strikes on infrastructure further intensify this pressure by disrupting production and distribution at critical points. The script presents these strikes as amplifiers of existing vulnerabilities rather than standalone causes of decline. When infrastructure is damaged or threatened, operational costs rise and output becomes less predictable. In an environment already constrained by sanctions, even temporary disruptions can have outsized financial consequences. This combination of external pressure and operational risk accelerates the erosion of energy income. The script underscores that sanctions are working, even if they have not yet reached their full potential. Their effectiveness is measured not only by immediate losses but by their ability to restrict future capacity and flexibility. By limiting access to capital, technology, and markets, sanctions weaken the long-term viability of the energy sector that funds the war. The script argues that this gradual degradation is precisely what makes sanctions powerful. They reshape incentives and reduce the state's ability to absorb shocks over time. At the same time, the script maintains that sanctions could work even better with expanded enforcement. Gaps in coverage and implementation allow portions of the energy and industrial systems to continue operating with relative freedom. By closing these gaps, the cost of war could be pushed to levels that become economically unbearable. The argument is not that sanctions alone guarantee immediate change, but that sustained and comprehensive enforcement can shift the balance by steadily increasing financial pressure. A major development highlighted in the script is the decision by the European Union to move toward phasing out Russian energy imports. This shift marks a significant change in policy, as energy purchases have historically provided Russia with a steady stream of income even amid political tension. The planned reduction of Russian LNG imports, followed by the phase-out of pipeline gas and eventually oil, signals a willingness to accept short-term adjustment in order to apply long-term pressure. The script emphasizes that this transition is not instantaneous, but its direction is clear. As these measures take effect, Russia's access to one of its most lucrative markets will diminish. The loss of European demand removes a key outlet for energy exports, forcing Russia to seek alternative buyers under less favorable conditions. This shift further compresses revenue and increases uncertainty, making fiscal planning more difficult and reducing the state's ability to offset losses elsewhere. With energy income declining and sanctions tightening, the script concludes that economic pressure on Russia will continue to intensify. The war economy, already strained by deficits, debt, and high spending, faces an environment in which its primary funding source is steadily eroded. This pressure is not evenly distributed over time. It accumulates, creating a compounding effect that becomes harder to manage as winters pass. The script ultimately frames the coming winters as critical stress points. Increased energy demand, higher operational costs, and reduced revenue converge during these periods, amplifying the impact of sanctions and market constraints. Under these conditions, the war economy risks being pushed past its breaking point, not through a single decisive blow, but through sustained pressure that exhausts its capacity to adapt. In this conclusion, sanctions and energy decline are presented as interconnected forces driving Russia toward an economic reckoning. The script does not predict an immediate outcome, but it establishes a clear trajectory. As enforcement expands and energy revenues fall, the financial cost of continuing the war rises. Over time, this trajectory threatens to undermine the economic foundations that support the war, making the coming winters not just difficult, but potentially decisive in exposing the limits of Russia's war economy.